Well, in this video we'll look at the Soviet perspective of the German invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, so Operation Barbarossa. It is interesting in many ways, for instance their portrayal of the Western reactions and how they explain various defeats. Note, for this I used the official German translation of the history of the Great Patriotic War of the Soviet Union, which was published originally in Russian from 1960 to 1965 and subsequently by the German Democratic Republic from 1962 to 1968 in German. Big thank you to all my Patreons that made this video possible. Note that the German version was altered in various ways and not just due to translation issues. This will be discussed in further detail at the end of the video. By the way, if you want to get in shape, you can do 2 burpees or 5 push-ups every time you hear the word fascist or a variation of it. Have fun! Let's start with the prelude to Operation Barbarossa. As we know, there was the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression treaty between the Soviet Union and Germany, but it also contained secret parts about the partition of Poland between the Soviet Union and Germany. In the official Soviet history, the pact is explained as follows. Only those blinded by hatred against the socialist state can claim that the USSR concluded the non-aggression pact with Germany not to guarantee peace and its own security, but to realize other selfish goals. However, the reactionary circles of the Western European states need this malicious slander in order to be able to shift the heavy responsibility for Germany's rearmament away from themselves. In this way, they want to evade the responsibility for the policy that led to the fragmentation of the anti-fascist forces and enable the German fascists to invade European states, one after the other. Meanwhile, we know that the Western Allies, namely the British Empire and France from 1939 to 1941 actually several times fought about attacking the Soviet Union, since it was supplying Germany with more materials through trade. This was a major problem for the Western's military strategy of defeating Germany by blockading its economy to gain the necessary resources. However, the concept of starving Germany economically in the course of a long war was torn apart when the USSR acted as a supplier and middleman for the German Reich. Although there were also political considerations as well, according to Hans-Joachim Lwowem, that another war in Europe could undermine French and British political power on the world stage and make European societies more receptive to communism. Keeping the balance of power in Europe was a key aspect of British and French interests. In Germany and the Soviet Union, they were faced with 2 powers that were not saturated in terms of their interests and could not be saturated in terms of the ideological foundations of their policies within the state system. Regardless of which partner the Allies came to terms with, the fundamental conflict with both powers remained unresolvable. The Allied politicians were unable to find a way out of this dilemma in the short term. In contrast, the Soviet history of the Great Patriotic War states the following. Since the reactionary circles of the Western European states were persistently striving to bring about an armed clash between Germany and the USSR, Soviet foreign policy had to be extremely flexible and prudent. The leaders of the Soviet state did everything in their power not to give the German fascists even the slightest reason for military provocations against the USSR. The Soviet Union loyally fulfilled its obligation towards Germany and thus convincingly demonstrated its desire for peaceful relations. For the German imperialists, on the other hand, the non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union merely served as a cover for preparing the greatest international adventure of the German militarists, the invasion of the USSR. Which in context of the previous statements about the Western powers enabling German expansion reads like Western appeasement bad, Soviet appeasement good. Which brings us to the next aspect, namely why the German forces in June 1941 achieved a surprise when attacking the Soviet Union, since it is specifically pointed out that the Soviets were suspicious about Germany. The government of the Soviet Union agreed with the entire Soviet people that German fascism was the worst enemy of the socialist state. Therefore, the Soviet people were on their guard against fascist Germany. One reason given is that Stalin did not act. One of the reasons for the wrong assessment of the situation was that Stalin, who alone decided the most important political and military questions, was of the opinion that Germany would not break the non-aggression pact concluded with the USSR in the near future. That is why he considered the reports of German troops preparing to attack the Soviet Union to be provocations intended to prompt the USSR government to take countermeasures. Now keep in mind that this work was published after Stalin was denounced by Nikita Khrushchev in 1956. Yet this pretty much aligns with the current Western historiography. To quote one work, several factors, some logical, some not, prevented a proper reading of German intentions. To start with, the decision-making structure in Moscow was over-centralized. A great deal depended on Stalin's personal judgment. Accounts vary, but it appears that the Soviet High Command did not receive all of the information that Stalin and key Politburo leaders did. It also has been argued that the information and assessments sent to Stalin were tailored by Golikov, the head of the military intelligence, to tell the dictator what he wanted to hear. Much came down to Stalin's personal view. Of course, we don't know what Stalin thought. Furthermore, the official Soviet history also names two Soviet generals: People Commissar of Defense of the Soviet Union Timoshenko and Chief of the General Staff Zhukov, noting that they bear some parts of the responsibility since they didn't prepare the Red Army for a sudden attack and didn't alert it soon enough. This seems to be mostly in line with the views of Alexander Hill, who notes about the strategic and operational deployment of the Red Army. Despite being watched the supreme leader, Stalin did not and could not devise and implement Soviet strategy alone. Those in senior leadership positions in the Red Army, such as Timoshenko and Zhukov, were most probably not just going along with the plan through fear. Their ambitions and hubris also no doubt played a part in the creation of the situation the Red Army found itself in mid-June 1941, just as it did for senior German leaders who supported Barbarossa despite the many arguments that could be made about its folly. It should also be added that by the time the official history was printed, that General Zhukov had fallen out of favor. He had an important political career after the war, but by November 1957 was expelled from the Central Committee. As such, this might also be related to the Soviet domestic politics, namely to denounce him further. Meanwhile, Timoshenko was already sidelined by Stalin during the war. He didn't have an important role after the war, so he might have been just a convenient scapegoat. Although I'm not sure about this, but these aspects should be kept in mind. One part also looks at the question why the Soviet Union and Red Army were not capable to defend against the German forces, and large areas of territory and manpower were lost. It is noted that the reasons are complicated and involve political, economic, and military factors. It is noted that, as a result of the defeat of the Western European states in the first period of the Second World War, Fascist Germany had the economic and military resources of almost all of Western Europe at its disposal, so that its war potential increased considerably. This is only partly true, although the Germans were able to capture quite a lot of equipment. In terms of economy, it took some time to properly integrate certain industries. And even time was no guarantee. I did a complete video on this topic, but to give a basic idea about the French industry, which was the largest contributor to the German war effort, the effects were limited. France became the object of German pillage and occupation. Its economy was thrown from a mobilization footing into disorder and stagnation. By 1943, even before fighting resumed on French soil, output had plunged to less than 70% of its pre-war level. Another aspect that is brought up is the political aspect, and that Germany was able to mobilize various allies. Of course, this is not so surprising since some of Germany's allies had their run-in with the Soviet Union just a few years before. For instance, Finland was previously attacked by the Soviet Union and Romania had to cede territory to it. Of course, the irony here is not lost on me, considering that the Soviet actions were backed by the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, so similar to the British and French positions toward the Soviet Union, the various allegiances shifted quite strongly in a matter of years. The next aspect is about the military factors. The Wehrmacht is described as follows. In June 1941, the German Wehrmacht was equipped with the most modern technology of the time and had considerable combat experience. Its commanders at all levels had acquired the necessary practical skills and understood how to lead troops, how to organize and direct large-scale offensive operations, and how to use technical combat equipment and weapons of all kinds on the battlefield. The German soldiers who have gone through the 2-year school of successful offensive warfare were well trained and experienced in combat, as the fascist troops had not yet encountered any serious resistance anywhere in Europe, Soldiers and officers believed in the superiority and invincibility of German armed forces. As the events of the first weeks of the war showed, the combat experience of German troops played an important role in the initial successes on the Soviet-German front. This is mostly correct. Generally, in summer 1941, the German armed forces were at their peak in terms of combat effectiveness. Although in terms of modern equipment, there were various issues. First off, motorization was limited, and in many cases foreign equipment like trucks were used. Some of these were even regular civilian trucks. As such, they had very limited cross-country mobility. Second, in terms of weaponry, Adrian Wettstein notes that the German equipment was mostly superior in the early campaign against the Polish and Western forces. This was not the case anymore against the Soviets. The Red Army had excellent artillery, anti-tank guns, submachine guns, and also good modern tanks, namely the T-34 and KV tanks, that were in various factors better than German tanks. Additionally, of the German tanks organized in panzer divisions, 743 were still Panzer IIs, 966 were Panzer IIIs, and a mere 439 were Panzer IVs. There were also various other tanks, so about 3,300 tanks. Outside of the Panzer division were another 150 tanks, which included Panzer IIs and French tanks converted to flame tanks, and about 250 Sturmgeschütze. So about 3,700 in total. To put this in context, the Red Army had about 1,300 modern tanks in the western districts, namely 337 KV-1, 132 KV-2, and 832 T-34s, and many more tanks of lower quality, for a total of 13,981 tanks and armored fighting vehicles. Although not all of these tanks were fully operational, only about 50% of the tanks in the western districts were operational, which is still about 7,000 tanks. Additionally, about 12,000 more tanks and armored fighting vehicles were located outside of the western districts. Similarly, the Red Army had also various opportunities to gain experience. Their troops fought in the Spanish Civil War, in Poland, and especially in the Russo-Finnish Winter War. So similar to Germany, there was a constant influx of first-hand military experience prior to the German invasion. Of course, the Red Army was deployed in smaller numbers, yet there had been a good number of combat veterans available. Although the official history specifically points out there was a lack of commanders that could lead large formations. The pool of commanders, which had been substantially replaced as a result of Stalin's persecution of the old experienced military men, had not yet acquired the practical skills to lead large tactical and operational formations under the difficult conditions of war. The members of the Soviet armed forces had not yet thoroughly mastered the new and at that time the best technical means of combat with which the units were gradually equipped. Previously, it was particularly noted that many commanders were Opfer unbegründeter Massenrepressalien, which literally translated means victims of unfounded mass reprisals. In other words, they were killed in Stalin's purges. Another aspect is noted as well, that the Red Army was not fully mobilized. Furthermore, it is noted that there were errors with the defense plan, and since some of the territories were not fully integrated into the Soviet Union so far, that there were various issues with infrastructure as well. This was of course due to the fact that the Soviet Union occupied large parts of Poland. As discussed in a previous video, the Soviets had two fortified defensive lines. The Molotov line, which was started in 1940 along the Soviet-German border, and the Stalin line that was along the former borders and started in 1928. Both lines were not fully operational when the Germans attacked. David Glantz notes about the whole defensive situation. The Soviet defenders had fundamentally misestimated the situation, both by concentrating their forces so far forward and by expecting the main enemy thrust to come south of the Pripyat marshes. Even Zhukov did not attempt to change this basic concept when he became Chief of the General Staff in February 1941. Thus the Red Army was off-balanced, concentrated in the southwest, while the main German mechanized forces advanced in the north. Let us look at the next aspect, namely the statement about strong Soviet resistance. There are various instances mentioned. For the Air Force, particularly various ramming attacks that were conducted once there was no ammunition left. At other points, it is noted, the very first days of fighting on the Soviet-German front showed the fascist conquerors that they were facing a completely different opponent than in Western Europe. Despite their great successes, they began to realize that the war against the Soviet Union did not promise them easy victories. This is in line with current research. Of course, there were deserters and collaborators at various points, even later in the war, yet in general German troops noted that the fighting on the Eastern Front was far more intense than in the previous campaigns. A battle report by the Panzergruppe 3 noted about the opening battles. Where the enemy chooses, he fights tenaciously and courageously until death. Deserters and surrender has been reported by no command. The struggle became therefore harder than in the Polish and Western campaigns. The final aspect that I found particularly interesting was the Soviets portrayed the reactions of the British Empire and the United States of America. The section is called The International Echo to the Fascistic Aggression against the USSR. Various groups are mentioned and cited. About the motivations of official circles of the USA and Great Britain to support the Soviet Union, it is noted, they did this, of course, not because they preferred the Soviet Union to Germany, but because it was now more advantageous for them to support the Soviet Union for political reasons. Germany had become too dangerous for the British and American monopolies to contribute to its further strengthening, even at the expense of the USSR. Furthermore, they claim that the people in both countries were pro-Soviet and in a way convinced their leaders to support the Soviet Union. The attitude of the United States and Great Britain towards the Soviet Union was finally determined by the consistent support of the broad masses of the people for the just struggle of the Soviet people and the tremendous upsurge of movement demanding active aid for the Soviet Union. Whatever selfish intentions and reactionary aims the governments of the capitalist countries pursued during the war and however hostile they were to socialism, they had to support the Soviet Union under the pressure of the masses and in view of the political situation. Before we conclude this video, some words on the sources used. The Soviets published their history of the Great Patriotic War in Russian, yet the German version was actually a bit altered, and not just due to issues with translation. There were various statements in the original version that were obviously wrong. For instance, it was a publication in which more German submarines were sunk in the Baltic Sea alone than existed, and a statement in fascist Germany intended to take immediate action against the USSR after the invasion of Poland had to be corrected by deletion. This of course could lead to some obvious problems. In order to prevent the German and Soviet versions from being played off against each other, the solution was devised of using an imaginary second Russian edition, which was not published at all, as a model for the German text. Hardly had the agreed corrections been made in 1962 when a result of the 12th Communist Party of the Soviet Union Party Congress, the original Soviet version was changed and Molotov, for example, disappeared. As such, some aspects in my German version are different from the Russian original or better originals. One minor aspect you might have noticed that in the translation Second World War is not capitalized. This is not an error. In East Germany, Zweiter Weltkrieg, Second World War, was not seen as a proper noun in contrast to Western Germany or Austria, where it is Zweiter Weltkrieg, Second World War. Although recently I have seen also West German publications from the 1970s that also used non-capitalized versions. To summarize, while some parts are correct, other parts are far less so. The communist rhetoric is sometimes quite strong, particularly the framing capitalist forces were basically enablers or even pro-fascist, and that the fact that the regular people were pro-Soviet and or victims. It comes across like non-communists are either perpetrators or victims with no agency. Another aspect was that Soviet losses and force strengths were absent in the parts that are read. It is stated that Western history falsifiers, westliche Geschichtsfälscher, overstated the failures of the Red Army. At least once, German losses were noted. Yet I did not see the Soviet ones noted. Of course, I might have missed something. Somewhere else, the force strength of both forces combined were noted, which is an odd choice. Whereas at one point, the relative force strengths were mentioned, noting that the German had X amount of the available men and equipment, in contrast to the Soviets. Thank you for Andrew for reviewing the script, thank you for watching, and see you next time.